All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a discussion of Gene Wolfe's Shadow of the Torturer, book one of Book of the New Sun. And I have as my two guests here today, Matt from the channel Matt on Books, and Paul Williams, a PhD student studying fantasy narratology or something along those lines. Right, Paul?
Something like that.
He-
Something like that.
He's a smart guy who knows about fantasy and science
Uh,
fiction, right?
I am as reliable as Severian in terms of describing myself.
Okay, fair
So you
enough.
have a perfect memory.
You have a perfect memory.
That would be a nice thing to have, wouldn't it?
So we are going to start with general impressions. And I'm going to ask you to give me your history with the Book of the New Sun. I am a newbie here. I'm the new guy. I am the one who I've only read Shadow of the Torturer, so that's all we're discussing today. So we're going to start with some non-spoiler general how we assess the Shadow of the Torturer, and you can include the Book of the New Sun in general because it's non-spoiler. Yeah. And then we will quickly move on to a spoiler-filled discussion of Shadow of the Torturer. So, Matt, let's begin with you, if you don't mind, and tell me what do you think of this in general terms, and what is your history with Book of the New Sun?
I'll go in the opposite order because I read it. I think I read it the first time when I was 18.
Okay. How was that?
And then I read it. Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting because it was kind of, I was constantly flip-flopping between, wow, this is really cool and imaginative and lots of funky shit going on, and I have no idea what is going on. And I like, it was just like every couple of chapters I would try and put the book down. I'd be like, I'm not smart enough for this. I don't think I can read this. But there were interesting things going on from the story in my mind. I was like, I want to know what happens next, and maybe some of these things will be explained. And I read all four of the books quite sort of back to back quite quickly.
Okay.
And when I came out of it, I was like, I got 50-60% of that probably. I'll try again later. And then I read it again when I was, I think, in my 30s, and probably got more like 75% at that point.
Wow.
And
that means you were 25% smarter in your 30s than you were when you were 18.
Isn't that like everyone?
Maybe. I don't know.
Like 18-year-olds are idiots.
Yeah.
I was definitely an idiot when I was 18 anyway. And this time,
look, some of us are still idiots when we're in our 30s. So, you know,
I'm in my 50s and I'm still an idiot, but I'm a lot smarter than I was when I was 18. And this time I bought the chapter guide.
The cheat guide.
Well, it's not really a cheat guide. I'll explain it later.
Okay.
And I bought the dictionary.
Whoa.
And
good choice.
I wanted to really get it, or at least get a lot of it this time.
I'm feeling distinctly outgunned right now, Matt.
Well, I knew I was going to be having a chat with two academics. So I thought I'd at least study this one book a bit more than I usually do. So maybe I can keep up with the two of you. This read, it's funny, I got about halfway through and I was like, this is Alice in Wonderland. I had such a strong feeling of Through the Looking Glass, where it's just like everything is totally bizarre and it goes from episode to episode and a lot of them don't feel very connected. And it feels like there's a lot of symbolism and it feels like there's a lot of deeper meaning, but it's not clearly explained at all. And I think I got a lot more out of it this time than I did the first two times.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Paul, what's your history with Book of the New Sun, and what would you rate it, or how do you think of it? What is it?
Yeah. Oh, and that's like anything dealing with Gene Wolfe. That's a very complicated, compacted thing that folds in upon itself, and it depends on which side you're looking at. So I became aware of Gene Wolfe, goodness, I think about 10 years or so ago, when I first got on Goodreads, and I started seeing people talk about this Gene Wolfe guy who is the greatest thing ever, and I was like, okay, so why haven't I heard of him before? And then I found out, because only because he's not like, he doesn't have his own bookshelf at Barnes and Noble the way that Tolkien and Sanderson do, and so I have this habit of where I do like tons of research into a book before I even read it. Or I research an author a lot before I read it, and so and
That
I
would help
actually
a
read
lot in this case, I'm guessing.
it definitely it definitely gave me some places to stand. So I actually read Wolfe's his Latro novels first, because those are what some friends and I came upon first, which are they're kind of the inverse. Those are set in ancient Greece, and they're about a guy who has brain trauma, and the question is and so every day he forgets everything,
Right.
and so it's his journals of that.
Memory is definitely a favorite theme of Wolfe's. Yeah.
Oh, I have things to say about that in a minute.
Yeah.
And so I fell in love with. That's when I became convinced that Wolfe was an author of just who was doing something interesting and smart. And so shortly after that, my friends got me Book of the New Sun for Christmas, and so I read I read the first half. It was Christmas of 2018, so I read the first half, and then I read the back half after the following semester had ended. And so that was 2019. Here we are, 3.5, almost 4 years later. I still don't know if I've recovered from what I call the sublime trauma of reading Book of the New Sun. Like it blasted something in my brain. We have those handful of books that just do things to you when you read them, and they impact you in this indelible way. And so that's what Book of the New Sun is one of those for me. It floored me, and it's one of those things where like Matt, and sounds like you as well, Philip. Shadow of the Torturer, I got to the end, I was like, I don't know. Like, yeah. I could tell you very little about what I think actually happened, let alone what it might mean. But then an interesting thing about Book of the New Sun is that as you go through it, it retroactively rewrites itself. At least that was my experience. And so things that were that seemed so innocuous, and that frankly I should have forgotten because of how offhanded they seemed in Shadow of the Torturer, as you work, particularly in my experience through the last two books, a lot of stuff in the first half really is revitalized in your mind as you do that. And so I have been just constantly returning to Book of the New Sun and just reading sections. I also, frankly, a great resource is the Alzabo Soup podcast with some guys who are they're just devotees of Wolfe, and they go through chapter by chapter, and they're now working on Book of the Long Sun, which I have on my shelf, and that's my present to myself when I finish my dissertation, if I get to read Book of the Long Sun.
Cool.
And
that's incentive.
Yeah. Oh, very much so.
Soup is very, very cool. They're not very academic or anything. They don't get into deeper themes, but they really go through what's going on.
Yeah.
On a more surface level, maybe, but just for knowing what the hell's going on there, it's really, really good.
Exactly. So that's been really helpful as I've reviewed the text, and it's like, oh, that's what's happening in that chapter. Oh, and that's helped me realize I think an important thing with Wolfe is the way that every chapter, yes, this is a series and things are well connected, but each chapter I feel is kind of its own crystallized piece that you need to kind of grapple with on its own terms in order to figure out how it fits in with everything else.
Yeah. Interesting. So this next thing we're going to do is, I'm not sure I would even call it spoilers because I don't know what's going on. So, I mean, it could be spoilers. It might not. I guess we're going to call it spoilers now. So if you haven't read Shadow of the Torturer, you might want to say bye-bye. But
to me, to be honest, it feels like a series, or specifically
I don't think you can spoil it. Yeah.
You can't really spoil it because it's an experience more than it's just a story.
Right. I feel that way too.
Yeah.
So getting back to the idea, we're going to talk about memory as a big theme. I think we could talk about human perception and
Yes.
how language is a tool. One of my favorite things that I picked up on when I was reading it is how language is a tool to articulate human experience, but it's a very flawed tool. And
well, it's like he also uses it constantly as a tool to obfuscate.
yes, exactly. So
Yes.
where I first started thinking of this is how many words, as soon as you start reading Shadow of the Torture, how many weird words are there? And they're all over the place. Like, I don't know what that thing is. There's no context. There's a lot of Latin. Okay, you cheated.
I thought you had a PhD, Philip. Come on, get with the program, man.
Yeah, not really
So,
close reading this at all, are you?
But I'm pretty sure Wolfe wrote it intentionally that way because it's alienating. He wanted me to feel. He wanted me to feel alienated right from the get-go, and to feel like I'm off balance because there are all these words I'm encountering that I have no context for. And I think what he's doing is he's messing around with this idea. Now, Severian being an unreliable narrator and all that, there are other layers to that. But one of the layers is the very unreliability of language when you don't have context for so many of the words.
Well, and especially once you get to the end.
Yeah.
And you read Gene Wolfe's own, like
his translation.
His framing of it is he somehow got a manuscript from the future.
Yes.
And he's translating it. And he himself very clearly says, I put in a whole bunch of words where there wasn't a word for it.
Yes.
So let's talk about this theme first, and then I think we can move on to memory. But what do you guys want to say about the unreliability of language, how tight it is with human perception? Because Wolfe, I think, is interested in pre-linguistic meaning. In other words, meaning doesn't just happen because of words. Meaning happens inside here before we allow the words to start manipulating the experience. Because memories, for example, are I think in part, yes, we can change memories with language. If we try to articulate memories, we're constantly tweaking them. But a lot of that meaning is happening in here. I feel like he's trying, ironically, to express experience before language gets its hands on it, if you see what I mean.
I had this time, and it's something I read over the first two times and didn't even notice. This time I had a very specific experience of exactly that in my own mind, because I'm coincidentally also a heraldry nerd, right? I have like 10 books of heraldry on my shelf, and heraldry has its own language. Because back in the days when people used heraldry, you needed to be able to describe something without seeing it. And it's a very, very specific language that says this kind of object in this kind of position, in this kind of color, and all of that. So Severian goes, he's talking about how the apprentices, the apprentice torturers like himself, all have this story in their heads that they come from a noble family, they're all exultants, or something like that. And he went into the cemetery and picked himself a coat of arms, which was on a mausoleum. And Wolfe describes the coat of arms in heraldic language. And there's a bit of it which is a ship volant. And I immediately went, ships cannot volant. Ships don't volant. Volant is not a ship thing. It's a bird thing. Usually. It means flying diagonally. Yeah, it's a diagonal position upwards, flying. And then I went,
spaceship.
Ooh, it's not a ship. It's a spaceship, of course, and it's coming out of the water. He's talking about like the whole thing is it's water with a fountain coming out of it, and a ship volant above that, and a rose below that. So it's a rose underwater, and a ship maybe kind of coming out of the water. And that automatically just blew all sorts of new things just because I understood this one word differently. It's not a ship; it's a spaceship.
Yeah. I think this goes to like to both the structuralist and the post-structuralist theories, right? That language becomes more like expressions of clusters of thought, and we are acculturated to experience and understand language in this syntactical manner, right? We create sentences to create specific meanings, but real meaning is when we simply bring these things together into these constellations that Matt's just illustrated for us, like how they can create elaborate multidimensional senses of meaning, which kind of adding on to that, this is probably the most famously quoted passage in the whole Book of the New Sun. It's the end of chapter 1, I'm going to say. Yeah, end of chapter 1, when after Severian has been given this coin by Vodalus, and it's the second to last paragraph, he says, "We believe that we invent symbols. The truth is that they invent us. We are their creatures, shaped by their hard, defining edges. When soldiers take their oath, they are given a coin and a simi stamped with the profile of the autarch. Their acceptance of that coin is their acceptance of the special duties and burdens of military life. They are soldiers from that moment, though they may know nothing of the management of arms. I did not know that then, but it is a profound mistake to believe that we must know of such things to be influenced by them. And in fact, to believe so is to believe that the most debased and superstitious kind of magic. The would-be sorcerer alone has faith in the efficacy of pure knowledge. Rational people know that things act of themselves or not at all." And so there's this element of, because language is ultimately just a symbolic act. Right. And so if symbols are what make us, rather than we making symbols, it's the fact that we are trying to constantly, because language is effectively, we take thought and we try to wrap it around a symbol. But if we're doing that, we each have our own original point of thought, and we can't actually know that when I say something or write something, that Philip and Matt experience that in the exact same way that I do.
Right. In fact, you probably can 100% assume we don't.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing, these are all kind of surface things, but one of the other things that I thought was really charming, which I think I didn't get the first time I read it. The second time I went, oh, wait a sec, is Severian is of course only explaining things the way he understands them.
Yes.
Apart from the fact that he's a liar, right? I mean, he's he is straight up a liar. I mean, I think it's that later. I think it's chapter 1 or 2. He says, "I have a perfect memory," and then he contradicts something he said right before that. Right? He gets two names switched. Roshan and Drotta. He screws up their names,
There's a later part where he's talking about his perfect memory, and he says, "Although I have a perfect memory, I don't remember what happened."
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's kind of full of shit, but
I will respond to that one when we get to Citadel of the Autarch.
Okay. The specific thing I'm talking about is, did you guys pick up, because I know a lot of people don't, that the first picture he goes and looks at when he's in the hallway with the pictures is the moon landing?
Oh yeah.
I only caught it because I knew about it beforehand.
Okay. The first time I read it, I totally didn't get it. I was just reading along and I was like, warrior.
I actually did catch that one. I actually did understand that. Yeah.
A lot of people don't get that. And he has, of course, no idea what it is. I mean, we don't know when in the future this is, but it's either far in the future or really far in the future. Yeah,
and obviously the American flag is a symbol that
exactly. He just says a stiff banner.
Right.
Yeah, the guy's holding a stiff banner.
Stiff because of the lack of gravity.
Stiff. Yeah, exactly.
Lack of gravity and lack of wind.
Well, and lack of gravity, and the moon landing, they actually had a bar at the top of the flag to hold it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
There was a metal bar on the top of it, so that it, because without anything else, it would just sort of flop.
That makes sense.
And because there is gravity on the moon, but it's only 1/6 of Earth's gravity, so it would just hang down.
That's fair.
So they had a bar in it, so it's really like a flat rectangle, and he just says a stiff banner and a warrior. Cool. Which puts you off immediately, but it's a guy who looks like he's in armor. So Severian thinks it's armor. He must be a warrior. You couldn't see his face because he's got a golden visor, a desolate landscape, but he doesn't describe it as the moon because the moon's green.
Yeah.
In his time, it's been terraformed.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so all of these things with the language he's giving us, it's very difficult for us to even follow what he's talking about or get the context of what he's talking about. But then when it clicks in, you go, oh, he's talking about the moon landing.
Yeah.
Or the fact that all the towers and the citadels are ships, rockets.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
I usually just,
so
I usually tell people that reading Gene Wolfe is an act of faith. That you have to, you know, as Neil Gaiman says, right, you must trust the text. It's all in there. And so there is that. But also, I always tell people, I'm like, Gene Wolfe, unlike any other fantasy author I can think of, writes like a modernist. I mean, and granted, there's tons of postmodernism as well, and he's definitely writing within the postmodern context. But on a technical level, he is most affiliated with the modernists, which makes sense. One of his absolute favorite authors is Proust, and like other novels of his, like directly riff on In Search of Lost Time, and he says, you know, Proust is so interested in memory and time, which are big concerns of Wolfe's. But yeah, again, it's this issue of describing things in such a tightly focalized perspective.
Yeah. So we can always return to these topics, and I do want to hear what you were thinking about Severian and his memory and his unreliability. Another thing, though, I do want to talk about, it seems like a lot in The Shadow of the Torturer, if you could describe the plot at all, I think it does hinge on several encounters or relationships with women. You have Thecna in the earlier part, whom he participates in the torture of. And by the way, that is a horrible thing that they did.
Yeah.
Then later you have the woman at the shop who tries to rob him.
Aegea.
Yes, Aegea. And then finally you have turning up out of nowhere
Dorcas.
So these three women, it seems to me, are key plot elements. But this is something we can talk about, perhaps, is Severian's encounters after. This is, of course, after he's been exiled from the only home he knew among the torturers, where he's certainly imbibed their worldview, but seems to be coming into contact with other ways of seeing things. And he's aware, of course, that the rest of the world sees the torturers as pariahs. But it's interesting how, I mean, some of them don't seem to realize that the torturers still exist as a guild. So it's just a strange thing.
Outside the Citadel, it seems like nobody really, like, they've heard of the torturers, but it's like a story or something, you know?
Yeah. So thoughts on the three women that Severian encounters?
Just quickly, I would also add characters who essentially amount to plot points. Baldanders and Dr. what's his name?
Oh, yeah, we got to talk about
Dr. Talos. They're also, they're not, they don't fit into the women thing. The women thing is definitely a very weird thing with Severian.
Yeah.
But those two are also, I think, pretty important.
And in keeping in mind too, guys, and you can react to this as well, I've had some readers who were uncomfortable with the way Severian interacts with women, and there's some misogyny and this is a fairly bleak world, but it is also a world where there's some pretty horrible treatment, I would say, of women. Some of which Severian himself participates in, right?
Yeah, I think I think it's okay to argue that Severian is not good with women at all.
Right.
Actually, also really fast before I forget. There's a fourth woman. There's Valeria he meets in the Atrium of Time.
Right.
That's right.
A short scene.
Right.
Yeah, and Thea as well, Thecla's sister.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Who he meets briefly in the
very briefly,
but encounters in the cemetery.
Yeah, in the cemetery.
Yeah.
So I think Severian, and there's always going to be endless debate about how much is this just Severian has issues with women and how much of it is, because Wolfe is more conservative than a lot of other authors are. I think he's still very much doing his own thing. I don't, but I think there is a degree of traditional gendering that happens in Book of the New Sun. So fair that is to recognize that that's a thing. But I think that, you know, Shadow of the Torturer especially is Boy Meets World in the sense of Severian has an entire cerebral mapping of the Citadel. That's what Severian knows.
Not even the entire Citadel.
Yeah.
Like a corner of the Citadel.
Yeah. And so he is consistently being confronted with the fact that his world is tiny. The world that he knows is so small. And it's a world that he only knows women. He has been thoroughly acculturated and trained to understand women only as clients to be tortured.
Or witches.
Yeah, and he's told that they can be witches.
He knows there are witches over there, and there are women.
Yes.
And then down in the basement, there are people we're going to hurt.
And he's introduced to the brothel. You know.
That's true.
Right. Yeah.
So he's.
But I mean,
really
everything before the book is basically clients or witches.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know.
And so he is. Women are a foreign entity to him, and I think that, and again, this comes down to the question about how tightly focalized the text is. If we are, and as we've already kind of intimated, we are getting this text very tightly from Severian's limited perspective, and if that's the case, then based upon how Severian has been raised and what he has been denied, a significant issue he's going to have is, what is a woman and what does that mean to me? And again, like and all due credit to any person, male or female or not, who reads these books and is troubled by the portrayal of women. I completely sympathize, but I do think that there is an element of, I think Wolfe is at least somewhat aware of what he's doing, and he is doing, I think, things deliberately. Whether or not those only of age, well, I think in your edition, Philip, Ada Palmer, I haven't read her essay, but I know that I listened to an interview once where she said, talking about writing, and she said that when she first time she read Book of the New Sun, it was just all the wonderful, awesome, cool dying Earth stuff, and then the second time when she was rereading it to write the intro, she was like, oh wow, yeah, that's there is some misogyny. That's uncomfortable for me. Yeah. So I think we are aware that it is there, and it's up to the individual reader to decide how they feel about it. I don't blame anyone for being put off by it.
Yeah, Matt,
absolutely not. But I mean, I very rarely care about the author. You know, if I can tell when I'm reading a book that the views that I object to in the book are clearly the author, then of course I have a problem with that. But usually, and certainly in this book, I read it and I think, this is a teenager who's been trained his entire life to hurt people. And like we just said, he's only ever seen two kinds of women, either torture victims or witches. And he falls in love with, in his mind anyway, every woman he sees, basically instantly. And he then also kind of does whatever he wants with them, usually, you know, and that's pretty understandable for a character who grew up the way he did. It does not seem at all unrealistic to me that in the situation that he was in his entire life, you wouldn't have a whole lot of respect for women.
Yeah.
You would have a lot of feeling of, I can do whatever I want, because the torturers do, you know, because they have this very controlled context where they're always in charge of everything. And they're especially always in charge of every client they have, whether they're male or female.
Not that he's not a brute the whole time, though. I mean, he shows empathy for Thecna, for example. I mean, he gives her the knife to end her torture. He seems to have genuine, I think, affection for Dorcas, and recognizes That's something
Yeah.
different from what he felt toward Agia, which was I think he sees that basically I was lusting after Agia, and I've got here kind of like a friendship going with Dorcas. So he recognizes the differences there. Of course, we're talking about Severian, the narrator, who's clearly older, versus Severian, the character, right? So
did you pick up? I went back and checked this just to make sure it's actually in this book. Did you pick up that Severian, who's writing this book, is the autarch?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I mean, he let it slip, and I thought, whoa, okay, he's risen in the world, I guess.
So whatever future is after this book, he, as he says himself, he backed into the throne somehow.
Right.
So
I mean, he lets it slip very close. I mean, at first he talks about a cell. He talked about the guards outside my door or something. And I thought, oh, he's a prisoner. But then I realized, no, they're guarding. They're not keeping him in somewhere. They're keeping people out. You know,
they are his guards. Yeah.
And he lets it slip later that he's the autarch. Yeah.
Yeah. And he mentions, I think, already in the first or second chapter.
First chapter.
He's in the first chapter. He says, sort of on the side, he says, you know, and how I backed into the throne.
Yeah.
You know, he doesn't explicitly say I'm the autarch, but he very clearly, if you're reading between the lines, he very clearly kind of says, you know, I'm in charge of everything, and this is my story of how I got here. And as soon as you get that, you're like, okay, so this book is propaganda, right? He's not just telling his story. He is the king. He's the autarch. And he's
ostensibly,
there's got to be an agenda for why he's writing his story. You know,
thoughts on that, Paul?
Yeah, many. So I want to emphasize, first of all, that like with a movie like Inception, I believe that there are multiple readings of this text, even though I have my preferred ones. But one of the things that to me indicates the strength of Book of the New Sun is the fact that it can sustain multiple interpretations simultaneously. And so I appreciate Matt bringing that up because it raises questions. There's a fun interview that, a write-up of an interview that the Washington Post did back in the 80s, and they asked Gene Wolfe, like, was Robert Graves' I, Claudius an influence on this? And he was like, oh, yeah, I guess so. Which I have not yet read that one, but it famously, right, it's about Claudius trying to basically explain how I'm the emperor, kind of happened. Anything bad that happens isn't my fault, because I'm not prepared for this, right? And Book of the New Sun, one very viable way, and I think a very, very powerful way to read it, is this element of Severian is not only revisiting his past, but he is using that past, or a version, an iteration of that past, for the sake of creating trying to create a specific discourse, controlling the narrative of his ascension. Because especially if you're a torturer who got exiled as a teenager because you broke the rules, and now you're the autarch, that raises some red flags.
I would say so, which gets into the question of his unreliability. And I feel like Matt,
that's really what the book is about.
I had the same reaction as Matt, which is, okay, he's the autarch, then what I'm hearing must be some kind of and here's my story, kids, you know?
Yeah.
But I also wonder, why is he unreliable? Is it because he has an agenda? Or is it because of the nature of memory? Or is it something else? You know, I think there could be several reasons that are not necessarily exclusive of each other, correct?
I think so.
The big question I have, which sort of hangs on to what Philip just said, he constantly reminds us that he has a perfect memory,
right? And
he constantly makes really stupid mistakes where he is telling the story wrong.
Or are they mistakes?
Well, yeah, of course. Are they mistakes? I mean, that's a rabbit hole you can keep, but he has a perfect memory, but are they mistakes? You know, why are they? Yes. Why is he making mistakes? and that just rattles around in my head, and I don't feel like I have any kind of answer to it. It's like, I can understand why you would say you have a perfect memory, because that's trying to impress upon the reader that they can trust completely what they're reading. But then, like, within 2 paragraphs, a name of a person who did a thing, I have a perfect memory, and then a different name of a person who did that thing. Like he in the cemetery, he switches Roche and
Drock and Roche.
Right.
Yeah, no, and you're right. And that is a very real concern. And again, like, if Philip weren't doing the first time through, I would totally go off on this one. I'm not going to, because it is
there's more.
Like, my love for this particular issue, how it comes about in the last book, is powerful, and so I want to preserve that one for Philip.
Yeah.
But
just in the context of this book, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it definitely raises questions. I think, for me, the reason, and again, it's hard because of my limits of memory and imagination. I am not entirely certain how I could read this outside of this particular theory I've got. But I do think. Okay, let me back up. So one thing I appreciate about Gene Wolfe is so when I think about good style and good prose, my first thoughts are Ursula K. Le Guin and John Crowley and Cormac McCarthy. Okay. Gene Wolfe is, I think, just as good as them, but in a different way. In that I feel that if you change any word in Gene Wolfe, you do categorically change any sentence. Like, I feel that these sentences are so specifically and tightly crafted that you end up with a very specific crystallization of meaning, or at least intended meaning. And so there are, as I recall these scenes that you guys are pointing to, there's interesting ways that those statements are kind of couched, that, to like, uses of syntax, as I recall them, that suggest to me an alternative take on them. And maybe what I'll say to that is, if Severian is doing propaganda, he's just doing propaganda, just trying to tell his story in a way to solidify his command of the throne. Okay, fair enough. He goes out of his way to do some very odd narrative expressions. Why all of this very mentally and emotionally present material, like where you just are very there, and you experience, like, I think maybe the best examples of this is the chariot accident at the Temple of the Pellerines, near the end. Like, raise your hand if that scene makes any sense to you on a lexical level. Like, it doesn't. It is one of the most mind-boggling, weird descriptions of anything ever. And I've read Ulysses. Not that I didn't like it that much, but I've read Ulysses, and still I have the hardest time with that chariot scene, or whatever they're piloting.
I would say the duel is a lot like that too. The duel,
the duel also
supposedly
where he dies.
He thinks he dies, but then somehow he's special, and the flower doesn't affect him the way it's supposed to, and everybody's like, "Oh, you're supposed to be dead."
I'm curious, Philip, do you have any theories as to why? I pretty much know why, or at least I think I know why. Why didn't he die?
Because he's special. I don't know. I mean, what I mean,
it's not spoiling anything from later, because it's all in this book. He was resurrected by the claw of the conciliator.
Oh, the gem that he had in his
he
didn't
know he had it.
He didn't know he had it at that point.
Yeah. It was on his person. So
it's basically, I mean, the conciliator is something like Christ. It's a direct artifact of
religious
Christ,
figure
is the idea.
Yes.
And
it's a powerful relic.
Resurrected. He did die.
Yeah.
Right. He died, and then was brought back
by the claw of the conciliator. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I did figure that out, actually. Yeah.
I also think it's cool that the first chapter is called A Resurrection and a Death.
Yeah.
Or is it just Resurrection and Death?
It's Resurrection and Death.
Yeah.
Rather than Death and Resurrection. Yeah. It
right.
reverses the order.
Yeah.
which we'll see again next book with eschatology and Genesis rather than Genesis and eschatology.
So is there a reason for that, or just to like make us ask why does he do that?
Well, what happened in that chapter?
Oh, I know what happened. Why reverse the order though?
So my take on that and would be well, so let's take the conceit of this entire story, right? Is that we are so far in the future that we've actually slipped backwards at the same time, right? We've gone more advanced, but also have actually become more retrograde technologically, scientifically, socially, and so forth and so on. And so the question is it a linear forward and back, or is it a circle? And eventually the circle comes back to this point. And so if that's the case, then resurrection and death is also death and resurrection if you get around to the right part of the circle.
Right. I like it.
So yeah, but yeah, back to what I was saying earlier, I think that Severian makes some auto narrative choices in how he embodies events if he's doing propaganda.
Right.
It's rather artful.
It's weird propaganda for sure.
Yeah.
No
fair.
question. I mean, the resurrection also, I mean, you could spend 2 hours just talking about the first chapter.
Yes.
That's another point where I thought, okay, did he die? You know, in the water?
Yeah, that's
it looks a lot like he drowned and was brought back by the giant green woman or whatever. You know, there's just a couple of sentences where you're like, what?
Yeah.
In the water and giant.
And that's kind of a flashback, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, stopping women throwing things at people is no basis for a form of government.
Right.
Yeah, no, and I'll add on to what Matt's bringing up since we're diving head first into this. Do you guys say Triskull or Triskele? How do you pronounce the dog's name?
Oh, the dog. However you pronounce it is good for me.
Tripod.
So
I mean, that's the dog's name. That's what Triskele means.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it means tripod.
Fair enough.
3 legs.
Yeah. We have our three-legged dog is by all accounts is dead when Severian meets it. But then it's definitely not dead. So, and that's before Severian has the claw. And so again, this raises questions. Is Severian manipulating his narrative and just trying to, drop hints that, look, I can do things and I'm special because I say so? In which case, did any of those things actually happen? Or is there something else at work here? And again, I will have more to say about that at later times.
Okay.
The bit where I really stopped and I thought, okay, this feels a lot like Alice in Wonderland was the Botanical Gardens.
Yes.
Where it's just like episode after episode and they're all totally surreal and weird and I have no idea what's going on. I think maybe I have a bit more of a feeling of what's going on. I still don't know what the sand gardens are to Severian, and I know that comes up later. I've got a horrible memory, by the way. Like me having already read it twice doesn't count. I don't remember it. It was like 20 years ago. So
you're the opposite of Severian.
I don't know if I'm the opposite of Severian, but I'm honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not lying to you about how good my memory is. But yeah, they go into I forget what it's called, but it's like the jungle.
Yeah.
The jungle one, and they climb up into the hut, and there are 2 people there who can't see them, who are obviously missionaries from modern times, like our times-ish.
Like I think even earlier than our times, like
early. Well, I mean, our times, like the last 100 years.
Roughly 20th century, late
19th, early
20th century.
Native who can see them, but only sometimes. And then there's an airplane, very clearly flying overhead.
Right.
It's like, okay, so the gardens are time travel dimension kind of something things.
Well, yeah, they might be. Let's also not forget that Aegea says that people who visit the gardens, some of them become enthralled by the gardens, and then they take on the characteristics of historical actors, basically. So are they really time travel? But also maybe. And if so, how does that work? And that's what, we have like the whole thing with Father and Neri's mirrors, which, to your point, right, mirrors Allison, through the looking glass and everything, because that's basically the theory that operates it, as I understand Severian's description, which, okay, but is right. It's this idea that if you oppose mirrors exactly, and you get light particles going back and forth, and if they collide, since the universe can't allow the paradox of multiple of copies of the same particle inhabiting the same space, this is the theory that Severian posits, is that one of those particles gets moved to a different timeline for a bit, and then gets pulled back,
which is pretty damn philosophical and scientific for a torturer.
Yeah.
That's another moment where I'm like, dude, you weren't thinking that when you were there.
And let's not
this
forget,
is future you talking.
Where he goes to get the plant, there is somewhere off in the distance some kind of oracle that you don't want to go see because you won't come back, right? Which means probably we'll go there then.
The Kumeyan, who was an actual oracle who did really exist in history, and was in South America somewhere, I think. That also seems to be the prevailing theory of where this is, like where the story is happening. If we're going with the idea that this is actually our Earth in the future,
and it's some kind of foreign plant though, from another planet.
No, I mean like the location of everything is South America.
Yeah.
Kind of what a lot of people are thinking, because he talks about the ice coming up from the south, and the seasons are flipped, and that kind of thing.
It's interesting. During this particular point is where we get Dorcas come into the story as well. She fishes him out of the water when he was about to
drown. Does she?
I don't know,
because he's reaching down, and someone grabs his hand, and then she's pulling him up out of the water immediately.
And she doesn't seem to know where she came from. Like, she has no memory of anything before that. So she's
water is also a mirror. Also good to keep in mind. But yeah, she has no idea. But the water also seems to be, the properties of the water are that it preserves people. So like you could be maybe in a coma in the water.
It's supposed to be people who are dead, but
you'll be
later.
pickled anyway. So, but I also think it's interesting how that's also when you get this sort of dichotomy between Agia, bad woman, and Dorcas, good woman, right? I mean, it seems like that's set up there in that
corruption and innocence.
Immediate,
Madonna whore.
It's a very Madonna whore kind of setup.
From Severian's perspective.
But I think one thing that's interesting is that Severian, while he seems to recognize these qualities, he has no idea, he doesn't recognize what it means, right? He recognizes that Gia is this way and Dorcas is this way, and it's like, yes, one is healthy, one is not. And like, as a reader, you're like, dude, like, come on. And he's so naive about it.
There's something missing from Severian. Like, there's something where I don't know how to describe it, but I don't want to say that he lacks empathy, because he shows signs of empathy here and there, like with Thecna and so forth. But it's like he doesn't think, or at least he doesn't report the motives, either his own or the motives of the people. Things just happen, almost in an allegorical way, like I said in my review. And you wanted to talk about allegory a bit, I think, Paul. Is that right?
Oh, I'm happy to do it. I mean, because that's an important, to my mind, at least an important way to at least understand a possible way of understanding Book of the New Sun is as this cosmological allegory. So Wolfe, he originally began this as a novella called The Feast of St. Catherine's, and he said that the two initial impetuses for this were, he wanted to do a story about a young man goes to war, because I don't know if you guys are aware, so Gene Wolfe himself served in the Korean War,
right?
And it had a really devastating effect on him. Like he had a lot of PTSD that he struggled with for a long time. And so I think some of it was, and we're going to see a lot of that manifest when we get to the fourth book. It becomes very obvious. It's like, wow, this guy has seen some crap. The other one, let me pull this off really fast. So I went to my campus library, and there's this book called Castle of the Otter, which wherein he gives it's just it's a record of a bunch of interviews he did and some other stuff he did related to about Book of the New Sun. He says, yeah. So Wolfe himself was also a devout Catholic. He converted to Catholicism after marrying his wife. But he was he also would describe himself like, you know, on the one hand, he was devoted. He received communion, he went to mass, all those things. But he said he was also he thought about his Catholicism. He didn't just accept what he was told.
Okay.
So he says, what pain does do is act as a motivator in all sorts of less than obvious ways. It is responsible for compassion and the hot foot. It makes people who do not believe in God, who do not believe God would permit it, think about God. It has been remarked thousands of times that Christ died under torture. Many of us have read it so often that he was a humble carpenter that we feel a little surge of nausea on seeing the words yet again. But no one ever seems to notice that the instruments of torture were wood, nails, and a hammer, that the man who built the cross was undoubtedly a carpenter too, that the man who hammered in the nails was as much a carpenter as a soldier, as much a carpenter as a torturer. Very few seem even to have noticed that although Christ was a humble carpenter, the only object we are specifically told he made was not a table or a chair, but a whip. And if Christ knew not only the pain of torture, but the pain of being a torturer, as it seems certain to me that he did, then the dark figure is also capable of being a heroic and even a holy figure, like the Black Christ carved in Africa. And so there's this element of, and Wolfe does not consider Severian a Christ figure, but someone who is someone who has gone through every phase of human depravity in a potentially upward climb, which imitates the allegories of particularly the medieval tradition that Philip knows a lot more about than I do. But yeah, so I think that, and let's also note that almost every named character in the series is named after a Catholic saint.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that beg us to see this story in a specifically allegorical, symbolically charged frame.
Thoughts on that, Matt?
Even not, yeah, I don't think so much that way. I think I think a lot about the story itself and not abstracting from the story. The story itself, I think it's really interesting, like as far as Severian's personality and his empathy or lack thereof sometimes, and the way he deals with things. He was trained all of his life before the story to inflict pain and not listen to people. Yeah, like the master says to him specifically, we don't listen to them. We're not here to, like, our modern maybe conception of torture is you use it to get information. Their idea of it is it's purely punishment. They're not trying to get information from anyone. They are forbidden to actually acknowledge or even listen to anything that any client says.
They just calmly manipulate the clients.
They just punish them.
Yeah.
You know, they keep them alive as long as they're meant to keep them alive and keep them in pain until then.
But it seems like there's no remorse in it either. Like, oh no, this is just
that's the thing.
Yeah, we're just doing our job.
Yeah, they're doing their jobs, you know,
Yeah.
and it's a very workmanlike, you know, they're trying to master certain techniques of how you peel flesh off of someone's leg the right way and that kind of thing. It's not about they don't take any joy in it, but they're also
sort of a
horrified
sacred
by it.
charge, so they build rituals around it, right?
Yeah.
Like his promotion,
the Catherine Wheel thing when he gets
they
promoted to
made a
journeyman
whole
and,
ritual out of this thing.
Yeah.
Of course, we do that with all our institutions. We devise rituals to signify.
Well, and that's a separate thing, or another thing that adds on to it, which I really thought a lot about. I mean, to me, that whole ceremony, basically a torture victim, Catherine, is blessing them. right? So they are being forgiven for all of the work they do, basically, right? They're having that weight taken off of them so they can just do their jobs. And in return, they do it not because they're cruel, not because they're evil, not because they enjoy it. It is just their job, and that's the way they approach it. They're very clinical about it, and it's their function in society. And that also then maybe the weird detached nature of Severian, that like he's just sort of looking at people and like, oh, okay, she's like this and she's like that. They're kind of different, but it doesn't seem to mean anything to him. It doesn't seem to touch him or move him or influence him at all. It's just these people are there and I'm not really listening to them, just like the clients.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that is important to notice about the story, right, is the fact, to Matt's point, in fact, is that how grounded this is in daily experience, right? Like, to Philip's beginning point, stuff happens, like, but there's no real. On the one hand, I feel like the writing is too controlled and too specific and too confident. We as readers recognize that's got to mean something, and there's got to be a story happening here.
Yeah.
And yet, what is it? Because it's a dude, as a young man, he drowns, lives, goes to a graveyard, thinks a woman is hot, helps her commit suicide, gets kicked out for doing that, wanders around town for a day or two, and maybe dies again. Okay, weird. Like, there's not a lot happening, and yet on the other hand, maybe a lot is happening. And so the question is, if it's allegory, is it allegory that actually happened, or is it allegory that is being imposed because Severian is creating narrative out of lived experience, right? Because when you narrate something, you inherently impose a structure upon it.
Right.
And so there's this outright. So we do not recognize in our own lives, while we're day to day, we experience the chaos of daily life, and yet we cannot help but look back on our lives as a journey that has brought us to a certain point, right? We recognize cause and effect and choice and neglect and stuff like that, which we impose that narrative. And so I think that there's definitely something happening. Again, whether or not it's something beyond Severian's own machinations, hard to say, but I think there's something at work there.
Primarily through, at least in this book so far, I don't have any feeling of Severian having any machinations in the story at all, really. Like, he gets expelled from the story. The real big S story is he gets expelled from the tortures and travels to Thrax. Towards Thrax. He doesn't get there.
Yes. He doesn't even leave Nessus.
That's it. That's the whole story. He trying to get to Thrax. He doesn't do a very good job of it, and he gets him mixed up in weird shit along the way.
Yeah. Well, and why is that? Because he's unmoored, right? His entire world has been fractured, and he has no sense of direction now, right? Like, he's been given a quest to go do a thing, but doesn't know. He's so just confused about his broken worldview because the world is so much bigger than he thought it was. And let's not forget, his teachers didn't do the one thing they were supposed to do, which is they were supposed to torture him. And so they promoted him. Yeah. Like everything he's ever believed has been upended on him. And he's very just baffled. And he's a confused, scared young man.
Yep.
So there are some characters we haven't touched on yet. Roche being one, the good doctor and his giant friend being another. We should probably mention those two as one of the bizarre elements of what we've encountered in here. There's this.
I love Baldanders.
There's also Father Anir, who seems to be kind of a master behind the scenes kind of puppeteer figure.
Maybe.
So what are your thoughts on any of those characters, guys? Should we start with
too little about Roche.
Oh. Roche? Okay, we'll start with Roche.
Roche and Drota, like all of the apprentices, don't really almost count as characters to me. They feel more like props. You know, like the masters seemed like characters. They were given a little more personality and shape, and they said more and whatever. But like all of the other apprentices, Roche and Drotta and the other one whose name I forget, they're just running around with Severian.
Okay.
Yeah.
They just seemed like props to me, kind of on his way out of the Torturers Guild.
Yeah. Is Rosh the one who's older than him?
Yeah, they're both older than him.
That's right. But
yeah, there's one that when they go to the cemetery, I think there's 4 of them, and Rosh
there's one who's younger. Yeah,
Drotta were older, and then the other one whose name starts with an E, I forget. He was younger.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. Like one of them, like is like Severian's superior for a short time, and then when Severian gets promoted to,
I think Drotta was the captain of the apprentices.
Okay,
yeah. And then so they go journeyman, and then Severian becomes captain of apprentices.
Yeah, isn't Rosh the one that Severian like immediately turns around and starts to abuse because now I'm in charge and I have to rule by fear?
No, that's the younger
other one.
That's the one who begins with an E or whatever.
Iata.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Iata becomes Severian's second.
Right.
Okay.
Severian becomes captain of the apprentices.
And I think it's a ritual where he beats him up as a way of, you're my guy now. You're going to be my second, but you have to. And
you go beat everyone else up now.
Exactly. Yes. So it was almost like a ritualistic thing. You get the sense that
it's what Drotta did to him.
Yeah.
Or did to Roche.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's a tradition, right? Early Severian himself institutionalizes it into a ritual for himself, even if it's not like in the dogma of the Guild of Seekers After Truth, right?
Right.
Severian himself apprehends it as a ritual. Yeah, I don't have much else to say about those guys. I'm kind of with Matt on that respect.
Okay. Well, let's move on to Baldanders and Dr. Talos.
Yeah, Talos.
Talos, yeah.
What do you make of those two? Matt?
I don't know. I just I don't understand them. There are some things I remember from the future books, which I won't talk about, obviously.
Yeah.
So I know that there is some pretty weird stuff going on with them. And I know what some of it is. I just kind of love them as characters. Like this huge, kind of slow, doesn't talk that much dude who is more or less the servant of this small, snappy, witty, weird, kind of trickstery kind of guy, and they're traveling around and doing a stage show.
Yeah, I mean, I would not trust them anyway. That seems safe.
Well, I might trust Baldanders. I definitely wouldn't trust the Doctor.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, so why don't you trust Dr. Talos? I'm curious.
Because he's just like immediately, as soon as he's on the page, I'm like, okay, this is a trickster guy.
He's a snake oil salesman.
Yeah, he's a snake oil salesman. He's constantly talking. He's constantly diverting and dodging questions and guiding the conversation where he wants it to go. And assuming, like he just assumes without ever really asking or getting an answer. He assumes Severian, of course, will be in his play.
Yeah.
I have a question too, and you don't have to answer if it's a spoiler, but when Severian leaves them, they're recruiting the waitress at the
Yolenta,
tavern or whatever, and then later there's this gorgeous woman with them. Is that the same person or not?
Yes.
It is the same. Okay, because he doesn't seem to recognize that. He doesn't.
There is a bit where doesn't he talk to her about that? She's been changed.
Yeah.
I don't get into how or what exactly, but she's been changed.
Yeah, Dr. Talos promises he can make her beautiful. And when Severian meets her, Dr. Talos has done that.
So there's something very suspicious about Dr. Talos then.
Yeah. So
everything's suspicious about Dr. Talos.
Yes.
He's dodgy as hell.
Yeah. And this, I mean, this will come up later on. Matt, do you think we should tell Philip like the nature of Dr. Talos or what?
No.
Okay, well, I'll leave that one alone then.
I think it's an interesting reveal. I think it's a very interesting reveal.
Not that I would object to you telling me, but for anyone who hasn't read Shadow of the Torture out there, I don't mind spoilers myself, but just in case.
Yeah.
There are a couple of really interesting reveals around Baldanders and Dr. Talos. which I think
Yes.
are interesting enough to leave.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair enough. Fair enough.
And not get into.
I shall be
Yeah.
interested but wary of that pair. So
They're dodgy.
in relation to that pair, I think this is a good chance to bring up the role of metatextuality in this book. Because like I think for me, I recognized it most clearly with them, which is so when I remember the first time I met Baldanders, and the first time you meet Baldanders by himself, right? I feel like that scene is an exact reference to when in Moby Dick, when Ishmael meets Queequeg and they have to share a bed at the inn.
yeah.
But with Severian, it gets distorted, right? Because Severian goes and he meets Baldanders and they have to share this bed. When Ishmael does that in Moby Dick, it becomes this moment that where Ishmael lets down his guard and all of his barriers, and he recognizes Queequeg may be a colored man, and he comes from a different culture than I am, but he's still a human being. Whereas Baldanders is this freakishly hulking creature that, as we have become attuned to the story world, we can assume is either one, not human and comes from a different planet, or two, is a human who has been genetically modified in some way, shape, or form. And that actually increases the barriers between them. And then something that should be super intimate but actually becomes more of a separation, is that they experience the other person's dreams.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is, again, so there's this excellent invocation of an amazing novel, but completely retooled. So with Talos and Baldanders, when I first met those two together, I was like, oh, it's the Duke and the Dauphin from Huck Finn.
Yeah.
And right, as you already said yourself, Philip, like Talos is this snake oil salesman. He's a smooth talking con man.
And there's also something weird about. I mean, he doesn't sleep.
Yeah,
and he doesn't want any money either. He gives all.
And he doesn't need money.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah, it is like the weirdest buddy cop ever.
Yeah. You mentioned gene modification. I wanted to. It was one of the notes I made. Did you guys pick up on for example, the way exultants are described? Exultants are not like everyone else.
They're very tall.
Yeah. They're much taller.
Yeah.
And the way he describes Thekla, I can't remember the details, but she has like a widow's peak that is as long as his finger or something, he says.
Oh. Yeah.
She's got this really, really pronounced, and the way he describes her eyes and things.
They're purple or something, right?
Yeah, she's got purple eyes to start with, and also the shape of them or something like that. Like she doesn't look like a person. Like normal people.
Yeah.
She looks pretty odd the way he describes her the first time.
And it's also highly unusual. I think she's the first exultant ever that he's seen
that he meets
their domain, the domain of the torturers. So this is a social class very much set apart from regular non-GMO humans, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah, it seems like the ruling class has been heavily modified.
Yes.
And every time any of them are described, they're always like crazy tall, but
and
really,
are we
really
to assume that
thin.
Severian, as he suspects about himself, that he has some of this genes in him? Because if he's now ruling over everything, they wouldn't just accept anybody off the street, right? I would assume.
Well,
which is also maybe part of his propaganda, because he does mention over and over and over again that so-and-so said he looks like an exultant, and so-and-so confused him for an exultant.
And he's tall. He emphasizes how tall he is a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, is that true? I don't really know. Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
If he ended up on the throne, which he says he did, he has to justify, I mean, like, to look like the right guy for the job, he has to convince everybody he's an exultant.
He could be delusional, you're saying.
Well, he does say he's insane. He does proclaim his own insanity.
He does say he's insane at one point.
Yeah,
that's right.
I mean, I sit on a throne every day. That doesn't make me,
different throne, Philip. Different throne.
Emperor. Well, So
I think. I mean, maybe he just backed up to his toilet. Could be.
Maybe.
So I don't know.
That
Are
is a
there other
possibility.
characters you want to talk about before I get to the end, where it got weirder than ever as they get closer to this wall? Suddenly there are all
Yeah.
these creatures and gremlins and furry things and I don't know what. It just got really weird there at the end, didn't it?
There
Yeah.
were men with beast heads inside the wall.
Like we're
and
getting to we're at the threshold now. We're about to leave the Shire.
This is the border of Nessus. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, if you could call it the Shire. I mean, it's pretty bleak.
it's not very Shire-like.
No,
Yeah.
but it's Severian Shire, right? So, you know,
That's
Yeah.
that's a weird way of looking at it, but not wrong.
Did you totally different thing, but just briefly, because I just thought it was hilarious. Did you catch the starship sailor with the sex toy?
somehow in all the weirdness, I must have missed that one.
You missed the starship sailor with the sex toy. Okay, it's a guy he met before. Like there's a group of people who come up to him and want to touch him and stuff because he's a torturer. And
Oh yeah.
special.
Right. But
And
when
then
he's about to
they-
execute Agia's brother.
Yeah.
Right. And then they go into the botanical gardens. When they come out, a group of those people are waiting for them.
Right.
And a guy comes up to him and says, "Master, when I was on the Quasar, I had a paracoita, a doll,
Oh
you see,
yes.
a genicon, so beautiful, with her great pupils as dark as wells. Her iris is purple, like exultants, like asters or pansies blooming in summer. Master, whole beds of them, I thought, had been gathered to make those eyes, that flesh that always felt sun-warmed. Where is she now? My own Scarpalagna, my puppet, etc." And he just goes on for like 2 paragraphs.
Yeah.
And he's talking about a sex toy he had on a spaceship. He's obviously nuts and traumatized by his time in space.
So he's
And
a
it's just-
Severian groupie. He's one of the groupies there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And if I remember, it's not a big spoiler. If I remember, he actually comes up throughout the books later. He follows Severian.
Oh, he's
around.
following them right now, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, at the
Yeah,
end.
he's following them
possible.
in. Yeah. Yeah, they meet him again
possible.
near the wall. And I
Okay.
think he leaves Nessus with them. I forget
Oh,
his
is
name.
Is this Jonas?
I can't
No,
remember if
no, it's not Jonas. It's not
Yeah.
Jonas.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
Jonas. They've met Jonas. He's also a starship sailor.
Okay. Yeah.
They met Jonas shortly before the wall.
Okay.
And he's at the wall with them. This guy, this crazy guy with the sex toy in space, he I think he just keeps popping up in the most unlikely of places throughout the story.
Okay.
I forget his name.
Well,
I have to go back and find him.
And you know, this maybe is a good, again, like in addition to metatextuality, there's an awful lot like I feel like Wolfe is doing the thing that many great, at least authors that I like and I consider great, do, which is all these different narrative styles and conventions are being poured into one text. And so, for instance, like this guy, I would have to study it out a bit more, but I feel like there's an element of a trope called the holy fool here. You'll see that more like in Russian literature, but it's the idea, right, of someone who has been mentally traumatized in some way to the point that they seem detached from reality perpetually. But in some cultures, they've been deemed like they've been touched by God, basically, and they are special intermediaries between us and that which is beyond. This guy has been to he's been to quasars. He's actually left Earth. He's been
Quasar is italicized. It's the name of the ship he was on.
Oh yeah,
But
okay,
he has been to Quasar.
Yeah,
as well,
he's been to space, right?
Yeah.
Which
He's definitely been to space.
He's been to the heavens, we might say, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this consistent like piling on of all these different things, which again, for me, goes back to the allegory aspect, because if all these things are manifesting, that becomes much more parsable if we take an allegorical view of the story.
Yeah, like it's a very common figure in quest narratives, this holy fool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another like I always get really hung up on visual details. I'm a very visual person, and I strongly visually imagine what I'm reading. If there's enough description for it. One of the moments that I was just like, huge WTF. What is going on? Dorcas and Severian come out. It's nighttime. They come out of a building and they see a building floating in space, which dissolves into sparks.
Yes, yes.
Like, okay.
But for Severian, it's some kind of calling of destiny, right? That's
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's also, I have no idea, like all of this book, I have no idea if it's a detail that's in any way important, but it's Gene Wolfe, so it probably is. Dorcas sees the building leap up into the sky and then dissolve. And Severian just sees it in the sky and it dissolves. Like, okay. I remember from previous readings, this is explained. I think in the next book it's explained, but in this book it's like,
yeah, I don't remember if it is. So, but as you're talking about it, Matt, like here's one thought I have, and maybe I'll be catastrophically wrong. So with that in mind, so for Severian, right, what are these buildings? Buildings for Severian at least tend to be spaceships, right? And we will learn at a later point that humanity's in timeout right now. Humanity doesn't get to leave.
Yeah.
So Wolfe is publishing this book in 1980, and I'm thinking, what is it? 1976, I think, is the Challenger.
I thought it was in the 80s, though, wasn't it?
It was in the 80s. It was definitely in the 80s. Yeah.
Oh, 70s. Oh.
My mind went there too. My mind went there too, though. But yeah.
But so I wonder if this is a building that is, someone has made a ship and they're trying to get off Earth, and
it gets shut down.
And someone said, "No, stay in your lane, humans."
Yeah.
Again, I had not noticed that detail before, but now I'm thinking about it.
I don't think it's a big spoiler, but for some reason I have this vague memory of some point later, it's explained that the Cathedral of the Pellerines was burned, and the Cathedral of the Pellerines is a big tent.
They caught that during their accident.
The tent filled up with air and flew up into the sky and burned up. Something like that.
Okay, you might be right about that one.
I think that's what it was referring to. But it's just described, again, it's described with zero context. And they both, like, it's not just Severian says he saw it, Dorcas says she saw it. They see a building fly up in the air and dissolve into sparks.
Well, and they also wonder,
all that's said about it.
They also wonder, are we the only ones who saw that?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe everyone in the city saw it, or maybe just a few people saw it, or maybe we're special,
But you never get confirmation either way that nobody saw it, they saw it, everybody saw it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back to
but
that
I think at some point it turns out the Pellerines had, because it had been defiled when Severian and Agia went in there.
Something like that, yeah.
They burned the cathedral and it flew up into the air.
Well, and they're on their way out the gate too, apparently. So Severian very nobly is going to return their holy object, which is the title of the next book.
Is he really though?
The Claw of the Conciliator.
Is he really though? He's gone to all this trouble in Shadow of the Torturer
to
convince us that he has the Claw of the Conciliator, but he didn't steal it. I didn't steal it. It just ended up in my bag. I don't know how it got there, but I've got it.
I think he's telling us Agia put it there, right? Or Agia put it there.
Yeah. Again, I'm extremely skeptical of Severian.
Rightly so.
He's dodgy as hell.
Yeah.
I respect that.
Trust him.
Yeah.
So any other things that you guys want to touch on before we conclude this discussion?
Maybe one event that's worth talking about is before the madness at the end that Philip was confused by, rightfully so, is that Severian tells us that he does perform in Dr. Talos's play, and the performance ends very abruptly when Baldanders notices something about the audience and it freaks him out and he attacks the audience immediately.
That's not how I understood that.
Is it? How do you understand it?
I
He did it on
understood it
purpose.
that was actually part of the play. And the reason he does that is because everybody drops their shit and runs away. And then Dr. Talos gathers up all of the stuff they dropped.
Right.
He's intentionally scaring them. I don't
They're
think he's
essentially
losing
looting
control.
their audience as extra.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
asking for donations, and then at a dramatically appropriate moment, Baldanders freaks out, but he's acting, and
I might be
scares the
conflating with the
audience.
because the play resurfaces in Claw the Conciliator, so I might be
Oh.
conflating two instances. So that might be it. Okay, fair enough. Just one other thing I do want to talk about really fast, back to the issue, I guess, of allegory, is the library scene.
Yes.
Because I've had this kind of brain explosion about it, and I might be writing an article about it in the near future. And a lot of this will, I'm going to be a bit cagey because this does somewhat tie into, it hinges in stuff from Citadel of the Autarch. But so I think a very important thing with Gene Wolfe is understanding he's a huge fan of Jorge Luis Borges, who I'm also a big fan of. Are you guys very familiar with Borges' work?
I actually just bought fictions, and I've never read anything by Borges.
Oh, I love Borges.
I keep hearing from all sorts of people like you that he's awesome. So I just
actually
bought.
teach some of his poems. You know.
Oh, I've actually never read any of his poetry. I would like
good.
to.
Yeah.
I have a professor who said that he's read one Borges poem, and his word was it was formidable.
Oh.
So I would like to do that. Rightly so. Anyways, so Borges, huge influence on Borges. Likes labyrinths, he likes puzzles, he likes misdirection, all these cerebral things that Wolfe likes as well. But and famously, Borges went blind in his middle age and became the librarian in Buenos Aires. And we have here a blind librarian. I haven't read Umberto Eco yet, but I know that he does the same thing. I kind of refer to Eco and Wolfe as like the two great disciples of Borges. They write the novels that Borges never wrote. But so Borges, one of his most famous stories is the Library of Babel, about a library that has every room in the library has 6 bookshelves, and every bookshelf has a book of the same, is covered, is filled with books that are all the exact same number of pages and height and everything. And so each and this library is seemingly infinite in its dimensions. In other words, it is the ultimate expression of monkeys on a typewriter. You have every possible conceivable text, every text that can be written on X number of pages with X number of characters of this size upon these pages is available. And someone that I once read, someone has actually done the math, and the Library of Babel would have to be like 4 to so many X powers light years in size to contain everything. So on the one hand, you'll have a book that is just the letter A endlessly repeated. Then you'll have one that is the letter A endlessly repeated with one period added, and so forth and so on. But you'll also have, eventually you'll find a book that has the complete works of Shakespeare, and you'll find a book that is a set of books, I guess, that would be War and Peace, and so forth and so on. And there are cults that form in the library that are striving to, because they believe that if you find if you find the book that contains your record of your life, then you will attain transcendence. And so we have
Severian's library has a golden book.
Severian goes to a library that is unfathomably huge, contains the repository of the entirety of human history in it, ostensibly speaking. In other words, this library, if you could read it all, you might be able to attain all knowledge. Also, the conceit of the Book of the New Sun, right, is that Severian has written this and he has somehow jettisoned it back in time, that a guy named Gene Wolfe has picked it up and translated it. Well, if this book is set in the far future, that book could conceivably get back to the library.
The book we're reading is in the library, probably.
Yes. And it's the book of Severian's life. It's the book that contains the record of who Severian is. If Severian only read that book, What would he attain?
I think his head would explode.
Well, he could read that book because he wrote it. I mean, he didn't write the translation of it, but he wrote the original that it was translated from. So
yeah,
he could.
and so then
I kept thinking, like, the book that he's always carrying around that Thekla gave him, is that the Golden Book?
The one that he keeps carrying, I believe, is the Brown Book, isn't it?
It's brown.
It's brown, but I mean,
yeah,
gold
well,
doesn't necessarily have to be a physical descriptor. It could also be a symbolic thing. It's the most valuable book, or it's the book,
yeah,
that turns you into an archivist or a curator.
Yeah, I just can't remember because they get multiple books for Thekla, right? And he only keeps the one.
The only one he keeps is the Brown Book. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, and so that's why I can't remember.
He steals it pretty much.
Yeah.
I
just can't remember. Like, is that supposed to be the Gold Book, or is the Gold Book one that Thekla kept and he took a different? I can't remember.
No, in the actual stack, the physical descriptions of the stack that she had, none of them were golden. The curator describes to him the Golden Book, which is the book that a child finds.
That's
which
right.
Inducts them into the order of the curators.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah.
Wow. Well,
it's almost like it's hard to keep track of everything in this.
It's
you think
it's got a lot going on.
But you know what's interesting?
The weirdest thing.
Go ahead, Paul.
Like, one of the weirdest things, right, is like which is more difficult, keeping track of things the first time you're going through and don't have anything to connect it to, or keeping track when you have a sense of connections and trying to remember what happened in which book.
Yeah, exactly. I know exactly what you mean. But and plot wise, a lot of this seems very random and on a superficial reading. But I think it's fair to say, and I do believe that speculative fiction, whether we're talking fantasy, science fiction, whatever, it doesn't matter. But speculative fiction is pretty ideal for plumbing the depths of the human psyche. And I feel like that's really what Gene Wolfe is doing here.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Unquestionably so. And yeah, strap in, Philip.
I'm all strapped in. Believe me, I'm strapped in.
It's also, I would say, I mean, in almost no way is it a typical fantasy or science fiction book, but one way in which it is kind of typical is that this first book is not much of a story, and it's a lot of setup.
Yeah.
Like a lot, although all of the things that we've run into seem like random and, we went there, but we've left it behind forever or anything like that. I do remember from reading it that, like, even in the fourth book, you're like, wait, wasn't this weirdly introduced in the first book and I didn't get it at all? So
does that mean we're going to meet these rats that can write later on and that sort of thing?
I don't remember if we meet the writing rats, but that was actually something else I wanted to mention. Again, as a person who's mostly focused on, like, how things look and the in-world, I love really getting into the depths of, like, the world building that people are doing. He has so many throwaway, or at least in this first book, seemingly throwaway, absolutely bizarre, super creative ideas.
Yeah.
Like, in one sentence, he says, rats can write with their own feces.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on.
And then
That's
just keep going.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, wait, in this world, rats write? What are you talking about, Gene? Stop there for a minute, please. And it's just constant. There's constantly these totally bizarre little mentions of things that seem completely unimportant. And the world has a texture to it, for me, that very few fantasy worlds do.
Yeah.
Just because he's constantly throwing in these little detail here, detail there, never really explaining them, leaving them mysterious. But it's like, okay, this world is really weird.
And kind of dystopian too, I think.
Oh, very
totally
much.
Dystopian.
Just wait.
I wouldn't want to live there.
Just wait.
Yeah, it gets worse. But it's messed up. It's really messed up, but it's got such a richness to it as well. And I mean, some of this, I don't know, I don't remember if it gets mentioned in this book. It's not a big spoiler. It's a world building thing. Gene Wolfe, the translator, tells us that people are riding horses. And then later on, Severian describes that horses have talons
Yeah.
and feathers. And you're like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure those aren't horses. That doesn't sound very horsey to me.
That's a translation issue.
Yes.
Totally. And he's misguiding us constantly by using words like that, where you immediately go, oh yeah, horses. Okay, understood. And then it's like, horses with talons? What do you, I'm confused now.
Yeah.
Well, I would say so. So Gene Wolfe, the actual author living in Peoria, Illinois, writing this, is toying with us. Gene Wolfe,
Totally.
the imagined translator of this, is doing his absolute damnedest to convey to us what we need to know. And the fact that we can interpret these things is to our credit. And this brings us to, again, back to the Neil Gaiman essay about reading Gene Wolfe. One of my favorite quotes ever, at least from a literature perspective, is when he says how there are two kinds of author in the world: those who are smart so that you'll know that they're smart, and those who are smart without needing to acknowledge it. And Gene Wolfe is the latter. Gene Wolfe is smart to make you smart. So I consider Ulysses was a monster to read, and I read that because I felt I should. I read it one summer with some friends a couple of years ago. I think the three most difficult books I've ever read in my life would be As I Lay Dying, To the Lighthouse, and Neuromancer. And
Neuromancer was difficult?
Oh, Neuromancer was very hard for me, at least. Like, I have a hard time keeping track of the imagery in that. I'm not as visual as you are, Matt.
Okay.
So it's a very visual book. Yeah, it's awesome,
yeah,
but it's hard.
It's very visual. Yeah.
It's so hard for me. And those are off. Those three. So Virginia Woolf, William Gibson, and William Faulkner. I think they're more like Wolfe. Like they invite us to follow along. James Joyce is an author who I think he is a bit of a bully. Like he is. He demands that you acknowledge his genius. And yes, James Joyce, you can speak 6,000 languages. I just don't care.
I started reading Ulysses a long time ago because you always hear, you have to read Ulysses. And I got about 200 pages in and I was like, I don't care about the story. I dislike the author.
Yes.
Familiar story. Very rarely does a fiction text make me dislike the author, but I could tell he held me in contempt.
Yes, I agree.
I was just like, you can go to hell. I'm not interested.
In contrast,
I DNF'd Ulysses.
In contrast, Gene Wolfe, I feel like he wants us to be in on it. He wants us to piece this together. He is smart to help us be smart.
I can imagine him in the corner giggling every time you get something,
Yes.
I also love how he pulls Tolkien and plays the translator card, at the end. Like, oh, I'm just translating this for you.
It just occurred to me, this is the only book I think I've ever read, which is an unreliable narrator giving you a story from an unreliable narrator. Like 2 levels of unreliable narrator.
Yeah, that's true.
The translator, he's changing all the words to screw everything up even more. And Severian's lying to us.
Which, by the way, Philip, are you aware that Wolfe actually corresponded with Tolkien for a bit?
I got the feeling that probably he was a Tolkien reader, but I didn't know that they corresponded. That's amazing. Yeah.
He actually, obviously Tolkien didn't get a chance to read Wolfe's work because Tolkien dies in 73, I want to say.
73.
Yeah. And Wolfe, I don't think Wolfe starts getting published, definitely not widely, until the late 70s. And so, but yeah, there is actually, so first Wolfe has an essay that it's one of those things that I pull up on my computer and then I forget to actually read it, but it's called The Greatest Introduction to the Mountains, where Wolfe talks about his own experiences with Tolkien. But there's also, there's published somewhere, if you Google around, you can find it, a letter that Wolfe received from Tolkien.
Wow.
Because he wrote Tolkien when he was, I think maybe in college, and he wrote Tolkien a letter, and Tolkien actually wrote him back.
That's pretty cool. Well, Tolkien was great like that. He wrote a lot of people. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I actually don't know too much about Tolkien himself, but yeah. So I know being a big Tolkien fan, I thought you would appreciate that.
Yeah. It's awesome. Yeah. Well, guys, this has been awesome too. I really enjoyed this discussion. I feel like this is going to help me a lot as I approach the second volume, or I don't know. Some people think this is just one book. It's 4 books, whatever, And one story, I'm sure that some of my answers are coming, but then I'm probably have a bunch more questions as I continue to read this, which is
Yes.
a great reading experience in my book. So
Yeah. Good.
Just quickly, is the plan we read one book every month and we do another chat every month?
let's do it.
That's my
Yeah,
understanding.
Yeah.
let's do it.
Please.
And we
Glad
can
to
have
do
the next chat on your channel, Matt.
Yep. Cool.
it. Okay.
All
Look
right.
forward to it.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you, everybody,
All
for
right.
watching.
Thanks.
And
Thanks,
until
guys.
next time.